Just a few weeks ago, everything seemed to be going against Carlos Alcaraz. One of tennis' biggest stars was suddenly forced to step away from competition. Questions about his injury started spreading across the tennis world. Fans wondered if he would be ready for the most important part of the season. Some even began asking whether his momentum had finally disappeared. But while the headlines focused on what Alcaraz couldn't do, Carlos was quietly preparing for something much bigger. Now, after weeks of uncertainty, one message has become crystal clear. Carlos Alcaraz is coming back. And if his rivals were hoping this injury would slow him down, they may have underestimated him. With the US Open rapidly approaching, every top player knows what's waiting. Jannik continues to dominate the tour. Novak Djokovic is still chasing history. Young stars are gaining confidence every single week. The competition has never been tougher. Yet despite all of that, one name is suddenly becoming the center of attention again. Carlos Alcaraz. Because his return isn't just another comeback. It's a warning. A warning that one of the most explosive players in modern tennis could be arriving at exactly the right moment. The Canadian Open may no longer be part of his schedule. But that's exactly why the rest of the ATP Tour is paying close attention. Sometimes skipping one tournament isn't a setback. It's the beginning of something much bigger. So why is everyone suddenly talking about Carlos Alcaraz again? What has changed behind the scenes? And why do so many people believe his return could completely reshape the race to the US Open? Let's break it all down. For most players, missing a major tournament feels like a setback. For Carlos Alcaraz, it became a calculated decision. After dealing with a wrist injury, his team faced a difficult choice. They could rush back, risk making the problem worse, and arrive at the US Open less than 100%. Or they could sacrifice one tournament to protect the biggest goal of the season. They chose the second option. That decision meant skipping the Canadian Open. At first, many fans saw it as bad news. But inside the tennis world, the reaction was very different. Analysts quickly pointed out that this wasn't about avoiding competition. It was about timing. The hardcourt season is where every top player wants to peak. And with the US Open just around the corner, every training session now matters more than every ranking point. Carlos and his team understand that winning another Grand Slam is worth far more than taking unnecessary risks in a single tournament. That's why the focus immediately shifted toward Cincinnati. If everything goes according to plan, Cincinnati won't simply mark Alcaraz's return. It will be his final opportunity to test his body against the world's best before stepping onto the biggest hardcourt stage of the year. And that's exactly what makes this comeback so dangerous. When Carlos Alcaraz is fully healthy, he plays with a level of speed, creativity, and aggression that very few players can match. He doesn't just win matches. He forces opponents to change the way they play. Now imagine giving that player several extra weeks to recover, rebuild confidence, and prepare specifically for the US Open. Suddenly, skipping one event no longer looks like a weakness. It starts to look like a strategy. And if that strategy works, the rest of the ATP Tour could soon find itself dealing with a completely different version of Carlos Alcaraz. A version that isn't just returning, but returning with one goal in mind: to remind everyone exactly why he remains one of the most dangerous players in tennis. Carlos Alcaraz's return isn't just important for him. It could completely change the balance of power on the ATP Tour. While he has been recovering, the rest of the tennis world hasn't stood still. Jannik has continued to build his dominance, collecting major titles and strengthening his position at the top of the rankings. Every tournament has reinforced the same message: if you want to win a Grand Slam, sooner or later, you'll probably have to beat Sinner. That's exactly why Alcaraz's comeback matters so much. For the past few seasons, whenever tennis fans have talked about the future of the sport, two names have dominated every conversation: Jannik and Carlos Alcaraz. Their rivalry has already produced unforgettable matches, and every time they step onto the same court, expectations reach another level. Now, with the US Open approaching, the possibility of another blockbuster showdown suddenly feels very real. But Sinner isn't the only challenge waiting. Novak Djokovic remains one of the greatest competitors the sport has ever seen. No matter what the rankings say, Writing him off before a Grand Slam has never been a smart idea. Then there are dangerous players like Alexander Zverev, Taylor Fritz, and several rising stars who know this hardcourt swing is their chance to make a statement before New York. The competition couldn't be tougher. Yet that's exactly the environment where Carlos Alcaraz has often produced his best tennis. He has never looked afraid of the biggest stage. In fact, pressure usually brings out the very best in him. That's why so many experts believe this comeback is about far more than simply returning from injury. It's about timing. If Alcaraz arrives in Cincinnati healthy, regains his rhythm, and starts building momentum, the entire conversation around the US Open could change within days. Because suddenly, the draw becomes more dangerous. The title race becomes less predictable. And every top player has one more question to answer. What happens if Carlos Alcaraz returns at full strength? That question alone is enough to make the rest of the ATP Tour pay attention. As the countdown to the US Open continues, Carlos Alcaraz isn't trying to make headlines with bold statements. He's letting his decisions do the talking. Skipping the Canadian Open wasn't a sign of fear. It was a sign of confidence. Confidence that arriving healthy for the biggest tournaments is far more valuable than forcing one extra appearance. In modern tennis, Grand Slams define a season, and Alcaraz knows that better than anyone. Every recovery session, every practice set, every fitness workout, everything is now focused on one objective: being at his absolute best when the US Open begins. That's exactly why the rest of the tour should be paying attention. A fully fit Carlos Alcaraz is one of the most unpredictable players in tennis. His explosive movement, fearless shot-making, and ability to turn defense into attack in a single rally make him a nightmare for any opponent. And perhaps the biggest reason for optimism is this. Before the injury, Alcaraz was already proving he could compete with anyone on the biggest stages. Now, after taking extra time to recover, there's every chance he returns feeling fresher, stronger, and mentally prepared for another deep Grand Slam run. Of course, nothing is guaranteed. Returning from injury is never easy. Match fitness cannot be built overnight, and the hardcourt season is packed with world-class competition. One slow start could immediately raise new questions. But if Alcaraz finds his rhythm early, everything changes. Suddenly, the US Open won't just be about defending champions or current favorites. It will become another chapter in one of tennis' greatest rivalries. Sinner, Djokovic, and Alcaraz. 3 names, 1 Grand Slam, and only 1 champion. That's why Carlos Alcaraz's comeback is being viewed as far more than a simple return. For many fans, it's a warning that one of tennis' biggest stars is preparing for his next big challenge. And if that warning turns into reality, the entire ATP Tour could soon have a very serious problem. Carlos Alcaraz's decision to skip the Canadian Open may have disappointed fans hoping to see him back sooner. But in the bigger picture, it could prove to be one of the smartest decisions of his season. The US Open isn't just another tournament. It's where champions define their legacy, and Alcaraz appears determined to arrive there without compromising his recovery. That alone sends a message to every player on the ATP Tour. He's not chasing short-term headlines. He's chasing another Grand Slam. Now the spotlight shifts to Cincinnati. If Alcaraz returns there looking sharp, confident, and physically comfortable, the momentum heading into New York could change almost overnight. And that's exactly why this comeback has everyone paying attention. Jannik Sinner remains the man to beat. Novak Djokovic is still capable of producing magic on the biggest stages. Several other contenders are waiting for their opportunity. But when Carlos Alcaraz is healthy, he belongs in that conversation every single time. The race for the US Open title suddenly feels much more unpredictable than it did just a few weeks ago. Because sometimes the biggest statement isn't made during a match. Sometimes it's made through patience, through preparation, and through choosing the perfect moment to return. Whether this strategy leads to another Grand Slam trophy or not, one thing is already clear. Carlos Alcaraz isn't coming back just to compete. He's coming back to win. And if that happens, the warning he has sent before the US Open will suddenly make perfect sense. What do you think? Can Carlos Alcaraz win the US Open after his comeback? Or do you think Jannik Sinner and the rest of the ATP Tour are still ahead of him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to Victory Zone, and I'll see you in the next one.